Today we have David McNally, who's a professor at York University in Toronto, who's going to talk about something that I'm sure has been touching us all, the financial crisis, and what the economic and political fallout of that is. David has authored a number of books on politics and economics, including Another World is Possible, Globalization and Anti-Capitalism. He also writes regularly for political reviews and magazines, including Historical Materialism, Relay, his own New Socialist, of which he's an important writer and contributor.
Let me start by saying that we are living through the first global systemic crisis of the neoliberal phase of capitalism. And it's really important to grasp all of the components of that. There have been regional, national, local crises in the neoliberal period. Mexico went through major crisis in the early 1980s and another one in 1994. East Asia went through a crisis in 1997, Russia in 1998, Argentina in 2000, 2001. But what characterized all of those crises I've just mentioned to you is that they were outside the core of the world capitalist system, number one, and second, they were regionally contained. They did not become global crises. What we are witnessing right now is the first crisis that began at the core of global capitalism in this neoliberal period, has now truly gone global, and is obviously, I say obviously, as you'll see actually there are some dissenters on the left, but I think obviously, is a systemic crisis of global capitalism in its neoliberal phase. And as a result of that, it is a crisis on multiple levels. It is an economic and financial crisis, to be sure. It is also a political and ideological crisis. There is massive disorientation on the side of ruling classes. We need, in other words, to see this not as a simple cyclical crisis, not just an ordinary recession. And the mainstream is struggling to properly define it. Some of you will have seen that a few weeks ago, a series of mainstream commentators started to use the D word, depression. But this week, the managing director of the International Monetary Fund came out thinking he finally got the right category they were going to use. He said, we're in the Great Recession. And so, this is the way in which, though, they're struggling. They recognize this is not an ordinary recession. That is not what we're dealing with. Because when you have the collapse of all 5 investment banks on Wall Street, it's not an ordinary recession. When they start to nationalize banks in the United States, we're not in an ordinary recession. When deficits be damned, do whatever it takes to preserve the financial system, it's clearly not an ordinary cyclical recession. It is, as I say, it is a systemic crisis of the neoliberal reorganization of capitalism of the last 30 years. Over the course of 2008, global stock markets lost half their value. That means that $25 trillion in wealth evaporated on global stock markets. If we move beyond the stock markets and we look at all the other financial markets that exist, according to the Asia Development Bank, something like $50 trillion of wealth has been wiped out since the crisis began. That means we're getting very, very close to a destruction of wealth equivalent to the value of the whole world gross domestic product in the course of a year. And in important respects, I would say, we are still in the early stages. We've moved from the first phase into the second phase, and each phase gets more complex because it gets more multi-layered. The first phase is the financial meltdown. The 5 Wall Street investment banks, 280,000 jobs in the U.S. financial services industry disappear, global stock markets melt down, and so on. But initially it's in the financial sector. But what has happened since the last quarter of 2008 is that the financial crisis has simply been the prelude to a huge crisis in global manufacturing. What we're now looking at is the forthcoming collapse of global manufacturing corporations. The movement into the second phase, the global manufacturing crisis, has meant several things. First, the center of the storm began in the United States, then Europe got caught up in it, but now East Asia becomes absolutely central to the crisis. Exports from East Asia are down by 50% on average. Thousands of factories have closed throughout China. In December, a manufacturing exporters group in India came out and said, we think we're going to lose about 500,000 jobs in export industries. 6 weeks later, they came out and said, oops, make that 10 million. It's as we move into this phase 2, as global manufacturing experiences a profound crisis, that the Canadian economy has been most dramatically hit, and not surprisingly, Ontario is getting the bulk in the early going. It will not stay regionally confined, but just in January alone, 101,000 manufacturing jobs disappeared in the Canadian economy. That's 1 in every 20 manufacturing jobs gone in a single month. But I now want to talk about some of the ways in which it's being interpreted and understood on the left. And I'll talk really about, I guess, maybe 5 main approaches that are out there. The first is what we sometimes describe as the left Keynesian approach, but really it's the approach which has dominated social democratic thinking and politics since at least the Second World War. And that is the notion that capitalism can be made more or less crisis-free if a sufficient regulation regime is put in place by the state and adequate social programs to cushion the disturbances of the market. In other words, fundamentally capitalism can be made a stable system with the right use of government policy. If you accept that assumption, then clearly the crisis must be about problems at the level of government policy. And so most of the proposals coming out of social democratic left Keynesian circles are, we need to re-regulate finance. And if we re-regulate finance, we won't have the crisis anymore. Now, I want to say a couple of things about this, because not only do I think it's wrong theoretically and so on, but it is so historically mistaken. Because the assumption is that deregulation of finance caused the crisis. Therefore, re-regulate and you won't have the crisis. But of course, if you actually look at what happened to global capitalism over the last 40 years, what you discover is that deregulation is simply a response to the actual structural changes in the system. And what I mean by that is this. Throughout the 1960s, we get the true emergence of the global manufacturing system, the multinational corporation operating outside national boundaries. Alongside that, we get the development of a global financial system, because these manufacturing corporations, which are multinational, are now developing all kinds of financial arrangements outside their own country of origin. And as new kinds of offshore banking systems emerged in the 1960s, largely because of a huge outflow of dollars from the United States, as the U.S. was covering all of its balance of payments and trade deficits, you get huge billions and billions and eventually trillions of dollars in offshore banking institutions that are legally based in the Cayman Islands and things like this. Even though, by the way, they were operating out of London and New York. But they, for regulatory reasons, set up their head office in like the Caymans or the Bahamas or Switzerland and so on. But in other words, what we got emerging from the 1960s onwards was a production system based on multinational corporations and a financial system which had already escaped national regulation. They were becoming truly globalized. And the idea of deregulation wasn't that it changed this order. What happened was really bankers in places like London and New York said, why should we be losing all of these global financial transactions to the offshore banks? If you deregulate us and you let us do that business, we can get a cut of the action that's going to banks and so on, financial institutions that are based in the Caymans and that sort of thing. So the deregulation wave of the 80s and 90s catches up to the transformations of capitalism which had already happened. So the idea that somehow national governments are going to come along and somehow re-regulate global finance is really trying to lock the barn after the horse has escaped. A second perspective, which has been put forward, actually argued most strenuously by my own colleagues at York University, Leo Panitch and Sam Gindin, says that this is strictly a financial crisis and it is not a crisis of capitalism. And Panitch and Gindin there say explicitly there are no underlying systemic problems of capitalism, like problems of profitability and so on. It's a problem of global finance. I think the serious problem with this line of argument is it cannot explain how what began as a crisis in the financial sector has become a global multi-sector crisis. In other words, I don't think it can account for the crisis in East Asia, which is clearly a crisis in the manufacturing sector. I simply think that to see it exclusively as a financial crisis is to miss huge dimensions of it, and I think it also leads to the idea that, once again, let's address the banking system. So nationalizing the banks as an adequate response. A third perspective, which is associated with the Journal Monthly Review, more or less says that capitalism has been stagnant since the 1950s, and it has because once you get monopoly corporations that can set their own prices, there's no longer ever a problem of profitability for corporations. Their problem is that they're too profitable. They got so much surplus that they don't know what to do with it. A different version has been put forth by the American historian Robert Brenner in a series of very important books on the crisis, where Brenner, like a lot of commentators, he's the most important because his studies are the most thorough and systematic, says that really world capitalism has never gotten out of a crisis of profitability that began at the end of the 1960s. And so really we're just in another phase of a 40-year crisis that's gone on and on and on since the late 1960s. And of course, what's really important about that is the recognition that what produced the great recessions of 1973 to 75 and 1980 to 82 was indeed a crisis of corporate profitability. There's no question about that. All the serious empirical work shows that from the mid-1960s to 1982, profit rates for corporations were systematically and persistently declining. So I think that's right. But I think it cannot grasp what has happened since 1982, and that's what I'm going to talk about in a moment. That is to say, the fact that that neoliberalism did work in important respects to restore corporate profitability and produce a new wave of capitalist expansion, but one that has been based largely in East Asia. But really, the analysis which I've presented in some of the talks and articles that Roger referred to at the outset really does begin from that premise. It says, yes, there was a crisis of corporate profitability which produced two major global recessions, 1973 to 75, 1980 to 82. That's absolutely right with a number of the analyses. But are we to imagine that the incredible offensive that global capital launched in the neoliberal period did nothing to improve things for them? I mean, I think most of us would agree with the following, that the period of the last 25 years or so saw very significant process of wage compression globally. That is to say, there was a terrific shift of wealth from labor to capital, internationally. I think every study shows this, and it happens for two different reasons. Either because of the employer's offensive inside a country like Canada, the United States, Great Britain, what have you, where union powers are eroded,